So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our visit with author and forensic psychologist Frank Weber. We're very excited to have him, and this program was made possible by a generous grant through the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So we're very thankful for that funding. And so at the end of the program, before you go, if you could please, there are some surveys over there. It's just 5 circle answer surveys on the table. If you could fill that out, that would really help us with the reports for our grant to help keep programs like this coming here to New Ulm. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Frank and we'll get started.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming out here tonight. I'm Frank Weber. I'm a forensic psychologist. So I'm the guy who gets called in to do interviews in homicide and sexual assault cases. I've profiled cold case homicides. I narrated a show on the Oxygen Channel titled Murdered by Morning based on a Maplewood homicide. I've received the President's Award from Minnesota Correctional Association for my forensic work. And I've got great reviews in the Minneapolis Trib and St. Paul Pioneer Press and my books and online. So I've been very fortunate. But anytime I hear someone speak, I always want to know why they're neurotic like they are. So I'm going to tell you that about me right away. Some of you people already know my family a little. That actually my grandma is from New Ulm, Elizabeth Dietz. And so Danny knows my family very well. And the Webers, of course, would come to New Ulm for Oktoberfest every year and enjoy the great beer and things of that sort. I tell people I was raised to be obsessive. So my dad's job in the military was to keep track of all the military equipment in the world on 3x5 cards in a building in Sacramento, California. This is before computers. So I was raised in a house where everything was labeled, and I mean everything was labeled. I remember looking over at the towel bar, which said towel bar on it, and thinking, what else could it possibly be? Do like small people come in here and do chin-ups? So I am one of 10 kids named in alphabetical order. I am F, the 6th letter of the alphabet, A through J. So yes, and you recited them all off? Yeah, so that's always entertaining. But it's good. My dad is a good guy, and it makes me very focused on details, which makes me good in my work. We all kind of meander on a path in our life, and I always tell people, start in a direction, you never know where it's going to take you. The job I have today as a forensic psychologist didn't exist when I was in high school, so it's like, how do you plan for that? But like most people, I started in the wrong direction and just kept making changes. First I was going to be a math teacher, and then I took calculus, and I thought, I don't really like this. And I thought, if I'm going to do something I don't like, why go to college? I can get a job I don't like anywhere. And so I started taking classes I thought were interesting, ended up with sociology and psychology, a lot of credits in there. So I got social studies teaching licensure, and I was going to coach, and got a job my first year out of college in St. Cloud. And then my daughter was born, and her stomach wasn't fully developed. And by the way, she's very healthy, and it's all good now, but the school's insurance didn't cover it. And so we went thousands of dollars in debt every month, and I knew I just had to get out of teaching and get into another job that had better insurance. And so I tested into a state job actually at Faribault at the regional center. And one of the guys I've met there the first week still gives me grief about this because I said, okay, what's the easiest job here for the most amount of money? And he said, clinical psychologist. Well, that's what I am. And so, but people who know me know I'm pretty intense with the way I work. So even when I got that degree, I thought I could work with victims, but I didn't really want to work with offenders. And then I got a job in a large mental health clinic, which had programs for both victims and offenders. And I was working with the victims and helping them through their stuff. And I got very frustrated with the offender stuff because most of them didn't even show up and nobody did anything about it. And so I started complaining to the Department of Corrections about it. And I've been teaching, so I love teaching, but because I couldn't make a living at it with insurance issues, I've taught college classes every semester since I was 25 years old, since I left my full-time work. And so I've been teaching college social problems. And they said, well, what would you do different? And I said, I can think of 4 things off the top of my head. Number 1, I'd invite their probation officer right here to the clinic. If they don't show up, you issue a warrant and you arrest them. They're court ordered to be here. They damn well should be here. Because the community thinks they're getting services that they're not even attending. 2, I'd invite their partner in for couple sessions because many of these guys are involved in relationships with women who have no idea of the types of offenses they committed, and they should know that, especially if they have children. Number 3, we need to develop a basic class on healthy relationships. 60% of all sex offenses in Minnesota are committed by people who dropped out of high school, and that's the same nationally. And so when you tell them you need to develop a healthy relationship, they've probably never been around one, and so they don't have that concept. They need basic information. And then finally, I do lie detector tests because I want something beyond the therapist's word that this person's making an effort to change. This is the old school lie detector test. It's called the deceptograph. 1955. If you've seen the movies and shows where the ink's going across the paper, they haven't used that for 40 years. It's all laptops now. And so as a matter of fact, I'll show you in one of my book covers, when we shot the cover of Lying Close, that she was actually hooked up to a running lie detector test when we shot the cover, and you can see it in the charts in the background. All right, so you get into this work, and then what do you do with it at the end of the day? You know, you spend your day talking to a serial rapist. You can't come home with your wife and kids and say, hey, guess what I did today? You know, you traumatize everybody in the family. And so I like murder mysteries. I like a really good murder mystery. And so I started writing them based on actual Minnesota cases. And I was putting them in 3-ring binders in the closet. And I did that for about 20 years. And finally, I was thinking, I'm getting pretty good at this. But then you start wondering, is this just self-delusion? Because I'm not sharing it with anybody. You know, so in 2016, I sent my first book, murder book, to a publisher. And I was fortunate to get picked up by a national publisher at the time, because back then you needed a national publisher to be in Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all that. And it's funny because then they called me and said, well, who's your target audience? And I said, well, me, I wrote it to vent. And they started laughing and they said, this is going to sell. You should start on a sequel. But I'm going to just share just a little bit about this. I got to grab some of my other covers here. One of the things I didn't realize when I got picked up by a national publisher is the power that they have over your books. And they didn't change any of the writing in my books. But one of the first things they did is they sent me a picture of a forest and a lake and said, here's your cover. And I said, yeah, I don't really like that. And they said, it doesn't make any difference. It's our book now. And so I always think if you have a good idea, you should be able to convince other people of it. So we got arguing back and forth about it. And they said, well, what do you want? And I said, I want a young woman waiting for a ride. And they said, send us a picture. And I said, well, it's just my idea. I don't have the picture. And they said, okay, we'll go with our cover. And I said, I'll send you a picture. So this is actually Jenny Brenny. She's a child protection worker in Bend County. None of the people on my covers are models. And so we took that picture and sent it to them. And they said, well, we still like our cover better. And I said, and first of all, they're giving me grief about it. And they were saying, you've never been published before. We're a publishing company. This is what we do. And I said, but it's the psychology of it that what's bugging me. And I said, okay, I know you have the final say, but before we go to print, let's go to a large book club in Minneapolis. We'll set your picture out on the table, set my picture out on the table, and we'll ask everybody to walk out with one. Every person walked out with this cover. Wow. And they said, okay, you get your covers. But here's why it's such a big issue, is, we say don't judge a book by its cover, but that's what we do. I mean, when you go into a bookstore, you don't have time to read all the books. So what do? You look at covers. And something catches your eye, and you flip it over and you look at the back. And if I can't get anybody to look at the back of my book, I can't sell it no matter how well it's written. And so the cover was a big deal. Just a little more. The second cover, this is Alicia Eisen. She's a social worker in Crow Wing County. They all look like someone from the actual story. And it's really funny when my wife suggested, you should ask Alicia for this cover. So I talked to her and I said, this is a weird question, because she refers people to me for assessments. And I asked her, would you be interested in being on a cover? And she says, you're going to make my mom's life. And she said, my mom always said, you should have been a model. And she said, I'm always saying, I'm good being a social worker. She says, now I can say I've been on the cover of a book. The third cover and the fourth cover, this is actually Elise Yates. She works labor in a pellet plant. This is my car before I hit a deer with it. And what's funny is when we're shooting these pictures, And initially I said, I don't have you lean in talking like you're talking to someone in the car. And they didn't realize how big your rear view mirror is. And they said, nah, you got to stand back. And then she was too high. And she said, well, at last call, I'm probably not going to be wearing my high heels. And so she took them off and she's just holding them. And then it was the right height. And they thought, oh, okay, that works. So she's the Serena character in the book. This one is about someone close to the investigation is leaking out information. That's why it's called Lying Close. And she's hooked up to a running polygraph when we shot the bottom cover. And you'll see these when you hook this up, these tubes that go around here and here. She's got the blood pressure cuff on, and there's things on her fingers. And so that's an actual lie detector test running while we shot the picture. Burning Bridges. This is Chloe Kapsner. The family farms by Piers. And this is sort of funny. This is on a railroad trestle over the Mississippi River. And Chloe said, well, where's the best picture? And I said, well, the best picture is going to be on the bottom trestle right out in the middle of the bridge. I said, but I wouldn't necessarily go out there. The train goes by up here. And what you can't see is she's 25 feet above the Mississippi River. And she goes walking out there, goes right in the middle, crawls down the bottom trestle, and I was telling her mom, she's standing by me, I said, she doesn't have to do that. And her mom says, she's a good swimmer. Yeah, it's a big river. And so this is Elise again, the Serena character. So I wanted the back cover shot on the other side of the dam. And I'm starting to have fun with these pictures. If you take a smoke bomb, on a perfectly still day, hold one in each hand like this and raise it like this, it makes a heart, a perfect heart. And so we shot that picture over and over again. I said, okay, now I want to go behind the dam and shoot that picture. Okay, here's the problem. What I didn't realize is that even on a perfectly still day, all that water rushing through here creates a wind. And so I couldn't get it to stand up. But I loved her expression and the sun coming in. I thought, I'm going to use it for the back anyway. And then my most recent cover is Black and Blue. That's taken on the Stone Arch Bridge in Minneapolis. And again, this is someone who looks like a character from the book. That's actually my sister's son, Matthew Green. And so on the day he shows up, he's wearing this white shirt. I said, I told you to bring a dark shirt. He said, well, I have one, but I might have slept in it in the airport last night. And I said, here's the wonderful thing about book covers is you can't smell them. And I said, so get the dark shirt because it's too light, with the whole background. So we ended up shooting that cover. I do one book a year. So this is 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So Black and Blue is my most recent book. And it's about Sadie Sullivan, a wonderful young woman. She was at 19, she was engaged to a white police officer in Minneapolis, and she, just a little bit of a background. She was raised by a single mom. Mom had 5 kids. Her husband was cheating on her. They ended up getting divorced. And so she ends up in this 2-bedroom place with 5 kids. The oldest a boy, the rest are girls. Think about you have a bedroom problem here. So the oldest boy and Sadie share a room, and they hang a sheet between them for privacy. The other 3 girls share a bedroom. Mom sleeps on the couch. Sadie ends up pregnant at 15. And they're very religious, good people. They decided to give up the child for adoption to a couple at the church who were trying to have a baby and weren't having any success. Very nice couple, even though Sadie really wanted to keep the baby. Okay, Sadie was allowed visitation with her daughter then every other Saturday. So she's out of high school and going to school, and the couple realizes they need a babysitter in the afternoon. So Sadie saw this wonderful opportunity. She quit school and took a job in a 24-hour Cub Foods, working 3:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. so she could babysit her daughter in the afternoon. One day, she doesn't show up for work, and they call, and they can't find her, and eventually they find her body on Plymouth Creek, which is, if you drive 494 and you see those tennis courts along there, in that area. and she had been raped and murdered. So the case goes unsolved for 2 years. And finally, an African-American male gets arrested for it because there was African-American male DNA on her. And then a couple years after that, her fiance gets arrested for a very violent crime. He got called out to a domestic. He arrested the guy and then went back to the home and raped the woman. She called the police again. He went back and raped her again. And then she called the police again and said, don't send that same damn cop you just sent twice out here. And he ends up going to prison, joins a white militia in prison. And in prison, when he's asked what qualifies you to be in this group, he said, well, I killed my black loving fiance. And once he's released, of course, he says, I just said that to get accepted into the group. And so you have both the suspects in here, the African-American male and her former fiance, are terrible people. And the issue is, which one did it? The BCA realized we got to reopen this case and just to make sure we've got the right guy here. Because they made some huge mistakes in the initial investigation. They actually never searched his home, even though that's where she left that night. Because that they were just so convinced that it wasn't him. And I'll talk a little about each of them, but it's interesting. When I tell you about one first suspect, you're going to say, oh yeah, it was him without a doubt. And then I tell you about the second guy, you'll say, okay, yeah, it was him without a doubt. But it was only one of them. And so the BCA knew they needed a white and a black investigator because it's Minneapolis to look at this case because you have huge race issues and make sure you're getting it right. And so it's an interesting story. So 2 years it goes unsolved. And they have DNA, but it doesn't match anybody in the system. But what it does match, the assault of a 12-year-old girl, an assault of a developmentally disabled adult, the assault of a woman walking home intoxicated from a tap room. And then finally, they have a situation where a woman, her name was Cheyenne, she was actually a stripper on her way to work, and at a gas station, this guy requests a ride from her, Rodney Reed, and who's the black male. And she offers him a ride, and then he tries assaulting her, but she escapes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the amazing things you can do in forensics now. But sometimes you just get a weird break in a case, and this was one of them. So they call in a sketch artist and ask Cheyenne to give a description of the man who assaulted her. And so Cheyenne's giving this description, and the sketch artist suddenly stops, and the investigator says, why'd you stop? And she says, I know this guy. And she says, what do you mean you know this guy? And she says, yeah, he visits his mom in my neighborhood. His name's Rodney Reed. And so they pull him in, and his DNA matches all this stuff. And what's interesting about the case is once Bobby Long, which was her fiance, gets arrested, then Rodney Reed's case is going to be reviewed, and possibly they realize it's going to be overturned. And so they want to go back, because they never prosecuted him for any of the rapes because they had him in prison for life to start with. But if he gets released, and one by one he starts getting out of all these charges, that they felt the developmentally disabled person wasn't a competent witness, and he ended up being found not guilty in that case. The statute of limitations had run out on his assault of the 12-year-old girl, so they couldn't prosecute him in that case. The case of the woman intoxicated walking home from the tap room, he ends up getting out of that charge because of a quirk in our law. His attorney dug out the actual statute, and he had been convicted of assaulting a mentally incompetent woman because she was intoxicated. But the actual Minnesota statute read at the time that technically you can't be considered mentally incompetent if you consume the liquor willingly. And so this is actually a true Minnesota case. He found not guilty based on that ruling. By law, she was not mentally incompetent because she consumed the alcohol willingly. And one of the concerns that was brought up right away, then you make everybody who's drunk a target for a rapist. And so just a couple things. And that's why I talk about these things and I write about these things, so we can get things fixed. That in September of 2021, we changed the law so that there is no statute of limitations on sexual assault cases. So that 12-year-old girl case could have been charged. You can't do it now because you can't do it after the fact, but there won't be any situation like that in the future. And we also changed the writing of the mentally incompetent, that someone who's intoxicated, even by their own doing, can't be sexually assaulted. So that's been changed also. So that's the benefit of doing some of this stuff and making people aware of it. Okay. So he sounds like a pretty likely suspect, especially when his DNA is on her. And they know he's lying about aspects of his case. But then you have her fiance. And once they start looking at him, they find out from his partner that his partner went into the wake after everybody left, and he was standing over a casket, and he was muttering to it, "You got what you deserved," and which is really creepy. And yeah, and there's and they start talking to his ex-girlfriends and about a lot of stalking behavior and things of that sort. And so, like I said, it ends up being an interesting case. With all my stories, the teacher in me has to come out a little bit. So, for example, in Lying Close, part of it involves a relationship between a white Christian male and a Somali Muslim woman in St. Cloud. And just a little about the history of the area. There's an area in St. Cloud they call Somaliville because St. Cloud has the largest Somali population in Minnesota. And just about that history, that the first governor of St. Cloud was actually a slave owner who moved to St. Cloud from Kentucky. And there was a woman who wrote for the St. Cloud Visitor who criticized him all the time for being a slave owner, and eventually got a vigilante group that threw her press into the Mississippi River, but it didn't stop her. And eventually, the Civil War broke out. He moved back to Kentucky with the slaves, and she moved out east and became a writer for Abraham Lincoln. Burning bridges. This is an interesting story because I had an investigator walk into my offices with 2 boxes of evidence and say, "I've read your first 3 books, they're great." He said, "I have a great murder mystery for you, here's all the interviews." And so it's about a psychopath who lived in St. Cloud. It starts out with a college student looking for a biological father. And they find out he's this crazy person who's been living in St. Cloud for a couple decades. And just stupid crazy. His history is true in there, but stupid things that, let me just give you an example. So he used to drive a convertible Corvette around St. Cloud. And he'd go through a drive-thru. If he wasn't getting his food fast enough, he'd stand in the seat, put his head in the window, and start yelling at people in the restaurant. And at one point, the couple gets out of the car behind him and says, "Look, leave them alone, they're just teenagers." So he turns them and drops his pants and underwear and starts yelling obscenities at him. It's like, okay, who does that? You know, it's just so over the top. And so the first suspect in that case was Native American. And so I talk a little about boarding schools and that history in that book. And it's interesting. A lot of people say, "I didn't know that until I read that book." But just to give some people some good information. All right. I will tell you this. No matter what you do, you have to have a sense of humor. You're not going to survive. And you think about, where do you get humor in your work? And I'll just give you a couple examples. Sometimes people ask me, why do people kill people? And probably the best explanation is narcissistic injury, which says, in Greek mythology, Narcissus was someone who fell in love with his reflection in the pond and then ultimately drowned in it because he was so enamored with his beauty. So narcissism is very self-centered. Like being a psychopath is not a clinical diagnosis. Narcissism is. And I probably should tell you, I studied with Robert Hare, who's the world's expert on psychopaths in Toronto, Canada. I studied with Masters and Johnson in their sexual compulsivity program in New Orleans before I came back and did the forensic work. So anyway, very self-centered. I was doing this assessment on a level 3 sex offender, and I gave him that diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And he comes back in, he's not happy about it. He said, "Well, Frank, I know you think I'm narcissistic, but I've just never been in a room before where I wasn't the smartest and best looking person." And I'm thinking, nailed that diagnosis. And he's thinking, this is just the reality of my life. You know, it's not my fault. I'm smarter than everybody. And some other things, like one of my favorites is I was doing the Slauson intelligence test. And this is supposed to be a simple question. How are a fish and a submarine alike? And the guy was just nervous and sitting there and finally says, oh, they're both sandwiches. I had to give him credit. They are both sandwiches. And this is one. Sometimes it's just sweet. I was doing an assessment on a 10-year-old girl, and she was telling me that people in her family get involved in relationships really young. And so I said, are you in a relationship? And she said, well, the thing of it is, a boy asked me to be his girlfriend in 2nd grade, and we really haven't talked since. So I don't know what's going on with that. In my books, the brother of the investigator is schizophrenic. I grew up with a brother with a disability. I know what it's like to keep someone from being bullied. And schizophrenia is just so bizarre. And people who have family members with mental illness say they love the way I normalize it, that sometimes you just have to laugh at it, and sometimes it's sad, but I'll just give you a couple examples. I was walking into the office one morning, and there was a schizophrenic individual in front of the office, and I said, hey, how are you doing? He goes, hangs his head, and I said, what? He said, last night, I was trying to think of questions people might ask me today, and I had that one written down. How are you doing? And then I thought, nah, nobody's going to ask me that, so I crossed it out, so I don't have an answer. And I wish I wouldn't have been in a hurry. I'd love to see the questions he did have answers for. Or another one was telling me, have you ever heard that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink? I said, I have. And he said, that's exactly what my life is like, but there's no horse. And I said, okay, I hate to ask this, but is there water? No. And I'd say, yeah, other than that, it's exactly like that. Yeah. It's, like I said, it can be very entertaining. Okay, some of the wonderful things we do with solving cases are, so I'll talk about some of the stuff we use in cases. What do you think we use more than anything now to help solve crimes? DNA. Well, DNA is wonderful because it's like pretty solid. But I always laugh about it because when you get the DNA report, it says 99.9999999, and every once in a while I get a guy saying, DNA isn't 100%. And I said, that's true. I said, let me explain it to you. If your parents had 64 trillion children, it's possible one of your siblings could have committed this offense. But being there's less than 8 billion people on Earth, it's probably you. So yeah, DNA is wonderful. But actually, more than anything, when cameras also, there's cameras in so many places now are very helpful. But cell phones are actually used more than anything today. Facebook. And yes, and things people put online. I mean, that. And what's funny is, like, I'll give you an example. I was doing an interview of a 21-year-old who had sex with a 14-year-old. And he said, I had no idea how old she was. I said, really? Because on March 22nd, she texted you, I'm 14 years old, and you said age doesn't matter to me. He says, you have that? And I said, yeah, I have every text you and her ever sent to each other. I read that all before this interview. Oh, okay. And so you have all that information. And that, the other thing about cell phones is iPhones put people in an area. Androids put people in an exact location at any point in history. So they've actually used Android phones to show that someone was at a site where the body was dropped off at the time the body was dropped off. And a lot of people don't realize with the new iPhones you can track them even when they're off. So there's a lot of interesting things with that. Here's an interesting Minnesota forensic thing. How do you think you get a footprint out of snow? Because you can't use plaster like you'd use on a gravel road. Spray beeswax. One thin layer after another till it hardens, and then you finally pick it up. And there's actually a program called Soulmate, which you put any picture of a shoe print in, and it'll tell you the size and make of any shoe. It'll say, it's a size 11.5 Reebok or a Nike Air Max, or whatever it is. Yeah. Remember in the old movies where if they had a notebook and something was written on, the page was torn off, they take a pencil and go over it and try to read what they don't need to do that anymore. There's a machine called the electrostatic detection apparatus. And with that machine, you can take, let's say, a stack of Post-its where all the notes are ripped off above it, and it'll tell you what was written on every post-it above that by different levels of minute indentations in paper. Yeah. And then there's so I talk a little about that one in Last Call. In Lying Close, I talk a little about the MVAC, which you can use to get fingerprints off of clothing and sheets and things of that sort. It looks like a dryer. And so let's say you have a sexual assault committed on a sheet, you put the sheet into it, you melt less than $1 worth of gold. When gold becomes a gas, it adheres to the oil and fingerprints. And then they melt zinc in it. When zinc becomes a gas, it turns gold black. And then you pull out the sheet, you see the fingerprints all over it. Yeah, yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things they're doing. And even in Black and Blue, I talk about, especially because in the very end, the FBI gets involved. And FBI has fun toys. And so you see sometimes on the shows on television where they have the thermal imaging and you see that kind of blob moving around because they know there's a body, whether it's on the ground or in the house. The thermal imaging that the FBI has right now is so good that they can be outside your house and they can tell you how many living people are in that house, not just how many. They can tell you who they are because it has facial recognition. Yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff. Okay, before we get to the lie detector test here, I'll tell you this. Okay, so people ask me, what's the weirdest interview you've ever done? If you've driven by St. Cloud, I've been to every prison in the state. If you've ever been to St. Cloud prison, driving Highway 10, you see those big black walls. And I'd been in there numerous times, and they kept bringing me downstairs, finally to a room that's all gray cement, floor, walls, ceiling, nothing in the room but 2 plastic chairs facing each other. Between the 2 chairs is a metal plate bolted into the floor with a chain coming off of it like you'd pull a car with. And they said, have a seat. We're going to bring in the man you're going to interview. So I sit down. They bring in this guy, orange jumpsuit, shackles on his wrists and feet. They bring him to the chair, sit him across from me. They take that chain and wrap it around his shackles, and they put 6 master locks in it. And they say, okay, are you comfortable interviewing him now? And I said, well, I have this guy on 2 rape charges, and I typically do that interview. He wouldn't even be handcuffed. And he said, well, he killed a gang member last night. And I said, I guess I'm comfortable interviewing him like this. And so we spent the afternoon talking. Weirdest question I ever got, I was speaking to a large group in Stillwater. And at the end, I was asking, anybody have any questions? And a woman said, hey, did you hear about that perv in Minneapolis who was breaking into houses and sucking on women's toes and rubbing their feet when they're sleeping? And I said, actually, I did the assessment in that case. I can't talk about it. And she says, I'd have paid him $200. Okay, I guess he broke into the wrong house. Okay, so the lie detector test. What's interesting about the lie detector test, and by the way, I only use this laptop for these demonstrations, so it's got like Windows 98 on it. It's like old stone. It's not really different than it was 80 years ago, basically. That it's measuring the same thing. It's measuring blood pressure, it's measuring breathing, it's measuring sweat. And I don't need any fodder for more mysteries. I don't need anybody killing anybody here. We're going to just be safe when we do these interview questions. So what I'm going to do is we're going to hook someone up to the lie detector test. And then we're going to have somebody write a number down and show them. And I think we'll do 1 through 5 because it takes a while to get through them. And I'll ask the person every number. Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 5? And just by looking at their profile, we should be able to tell which number it is. I'll have them tell them no every time. And so we should be able to see which one they're lying on. So, do we have a volunteer to get hooked up to the lie detector test? You will? All right. Okay. I'm going to ask, is there a friend or female here that can help hook you up to this?
Who do I know here?
Anybody, would one of you just mind coming up and helping? Okay, you'll see why in a little bit. All right. So this is one of the pneumo tubes. And this is how, she's going to have to, actually, can you take your sweatshirt off? Mm-hmm. So she's going to have to And if you want to step on
Is that
screen
all
and
right?
do
I
that.
don't want to invade your personal space.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. So the first one goes here, and the second one goes here.
Okay.
And this is how they hook. So from behind, you just put it in here wherever it's, and it's not, doesn't have to be tight. So don't make, as a matter of fact, don't make it too tight. So raise your arms up, it'd be the easiest, yep. Okay. I guess I don't have to raise my arms up.
Oh, no, don't take my picture.
Yeah, she's under arrest. Well, how many people can say I went out tonight and they gave me a lie detector test?
Probably tighten up so it doesn't slide down, I'm guessing, right?
Yep, yep, that's all. That's actually fine. And then the next one is just across the waist. All right, perfect. So we're getting readings. The green is that breathing.
Oh, that's a good thing. I'm glad to know I'm breathing.
Keep breathing, that's a good thing. Okay, so you right-handed or left-handed?
Right-handed.
You got it around the chair, not the. Yeah.
Oh,
Can you turn down the lights? We can't see that reflection.
I'm not sure. If can you? Thank you. And so this will go over her right arm.
I don't know how to do these.
Yeah, I would imagine.
I work in healthcare. One of the first pictures at the clinic.
Okay.
There is no electric shock or anything, just so
Oh,
you
well,
know
that's
that.
good.
And then I should be able to do this last one. But thank you so much for your help. So, yeah, it pulls through and then you pull it over. It's kind of, I would say a little awkward, honestly.
Usually I want to have this part at the bottom.
Yeah, it should be at the bottom.
But it
For
looks-
regular
Really?
pressure.
However you can put it on, I'm good with.
Okay. But that doesn't,
Yeah, it would go that way.
Oh, you're right. Thank you.
if that's all right with you on my
No, no, you're smarter than I am on this, so.
Tilt this forward a little bit.
And this is falling down.
Yeah, I'll
this way.
already do it.
Maybe.
And just, I actually don't do lie detector tests. I contract with guys from the BCA to do them. One of the best in the area is Bob Berg. He does a great job on them.
Arm up, yep.
But I have a machine, because when I started my company, we did lie detector tests, and I employed a guy to just do them. But eventually, so I'm gonna use these two fingers.
Okay.
He didn't want to do them anymore, because if you think about it, if you do lie detector tests, who do you spend your day talking to?
Thank you.
Liars, right? Who gets referred to a lie detector test? People who are lying about something. And he just got tired of it. He said, I want to do therapy. I don't want to spend all my day talking to liars every day. And, okay, so if you want to just hold your hand down. Let me see. So it looks like we're getting, okay. No, I'm sorry. It's too bright?
There,
Okay.
perfect.
I can maybe set something behind it. I need to redo this for whatever reason it's not reading.
Okay.
Tell me just to hold it, I don't mind.
Or even set like books or something behind it, either, with anything.
What is on the screen?
If you want to look, it's just the lines, the charts.
Oh, okay.
Tell me when.
Perfect. Oh, perfect.
Okay, now that's good. That one's reading, so I'm going to get this one reading. Okay.
Should I think of something to lie about?
All right, now we're back in business. And then I need to pump this up. Whoops,
Just one finger or both?
should be both.
Yeah.
Oops, so you see the bottom one, that flat line is when this fell off, so. So put that back down.
Looks
Okay,
like it's gonna fall off again. Do you want it that loose? Maybe it's okay.
is that pumping up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me look at this. Okay, what is your first name?
Donna
Okay. And where do you live, Donna?
in New Ulm.
Okay. So I need to have someone write this number down.
Should I have lied about it?
No. Well, this is really funny, because one of the last times I did this, I asked the person, okay, I'm gonna ask you every number, and you tell me no for every number. And I said, is it number 1? She says, no. I said, is it number 2? No. I said, number 3? And she's just sweating, and she's, okay, yes. And she said, I feel like I shouldn't lie to you. And I say, okay, but how can I show how this works if you don't lie to me? I need to lie to me.
Go to confession.
Okay. So, did you say Donna?
Uh-huh,
I'm going to say, is your name Donna? You say yes. I'm going to
Yes.
ask, do you live in New Ulm? You say yes.
yes.
And then I'm going to ask you all 5 of the numbers. You say no to every one.
Okay,
So I need someone to write 1 through 5 on here. Who wants to write it down? Go ahead. And just show it to her, but don't show it to me.
So I write 1, comma, or?
Well, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Any one of those numbers. One number, yes. So show it to her, but I don't want to see it. Did she see it? Okay. So, feet flat on the ground, look ahead at the picture on the wall, and we'll start doing this. Okay. Now I got to be in a spot where I can also see the charts. Is your name Donna?
yes.
Do you live in New Ulm?
Yes.
Was the number 1?
No.
Was the number 2?
No.
Was the number 3?
No.
Was the number 4?
No.
Was the number 5?
No.
Was the number 3?
No.
Was it 5?
No.
What was it? Honestly.
I have to be honest.
Yes.
2.
Wow, okay, yeah. What we're looking for, I couldn't, honestly, that was a hard chart to read. That typically, you're seeing it's pretty level, and then you see a big, but I just saw a slight one at the 3, and then a 5, I was wondering, okay, maybe, but honestly, I wouldn't have guessed 2.
So the moral of the story is I can be a professional liar
Right?
now?
You're good. You want to help unhook her again? I'm right, I can do this, I'm right about 75% of the time. The truth is, the polygraph examiners I use are right 99% of the time. But they also do it differently. That they go through every question 3 times, and then they put the charts on top of each other, so they can look at how every chart, so there's no one reflection that really changes it. Plus, this isn't a great anxiety-provoking question. If she'd have just killed somebody, she'd have a lot more anxiety. Well, I'm hoping anyway you didn't. Because what happens is, because people think sometimes that, well, I'm too nervous, I can't do a lie detector test. Well, you're the perfect person for it. The more anxious you are, the easier it is to read. And so what they love, actually, so what happens is before people are getting hooked up, they'll start making comments to them just to increase their anxiety. So the charts are easier to read. And I have to tell you, Dick Plopnik was the guy who gave me this old one. He was one of the first polygraph examiners for the BCA, and he was who I worked with. He was just close to retiring when I started in the field. And Dick was one of those old hardcore investigators. You think of like the Dirty Harry movies, that guy. And I had him to give someone a lie detector test for me, and the guy was obviously lying. And finally, when he got done, Dick was telling him that he failed. The guy says, the only reason I failed is because it's so damn hot in here. And Dick turns from real casually and says, well, imagine what it's going to be like for you when you get to hell. Yeah, it was very entertaining to work with. The other thing is, if you want to write, you live in Minnesota. You know, you live in New Ulm. You know great characters for stories. You know that we all do. That there's people that we live around that are just funny or weird or absurd. And I share, so I have some actual characters in my books. As a matter of fact, when I first wrote Murder Book, I thought about, I don't even know if I should publish this because the personal life of the investigator is actually more true than I care to admit, but I thought, well, everybody's going to think it's fiction anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. For example, in Last Call, there's a character in one of the communities. They had a lot of guys named Ray, and it sort of reminds me, a few years ago I went to Ireland and toured Guinness Brewery, and when I was there, they had all these guys named Daniel Olson. And he said, if you have 20 employees named Daniel Olson, everybody has to have a nickname. And so in this community, there was a lot of guys named Ray. And so they called one guy, first they called him Oktoberfest Ray because he didn't go out until after the harvest. And Oct is what in German? Eight, right. So then they called him Ray 8, and eventually just Rate. Another guy had the unfortunate moniker as Ray Lowscheider. After Jennifer Lopez changed her name to J-Lo, they called him Ray-Lo. But my favorite guy was a guy we called Ray Ray. And we called him Ray Ray because he repeated everything he said. That he would go into a bar, give me a beer, gotta go. And he was, one of those guys who kind of like bullshit a level above everybody else. So he'd get in there and he'd see the bartender was busy and kind of tantrum, and he'd look around and find somebody who had just had a full 16-ounce glass of beer in front of him. And he'd go over and start talking to him and tell him, there's a trick I can do. I can drink an entire 16-ounce glass of beer in one swallow. And they would have this conversation. Well, that's impossible. And Ray would say, look, I don't want to take your money. Let's just bet a quarter on it. So Ray would take his glass of beer, tip it up, start drinking it, take him about a dozen swallows to put it down, and set it back on the bar and say, I guess you're right. You'd give him a quarter and walk away. Yeah. So, yeah, and that's, like I said, he's that guy, that. And so it's fun just to have some of those stories. And one of my favorite ones with Ray was some guy was kind of being obnoxious, and Ray was supposed to give him a ride home. And Ray says, I'm going to make you walk. I'm not going to give you a ride home. So the guy lived about a mile from the bar, so he starts walking, and he's almost home. And Ray goes and gets him and says, look, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And he says, I tell you what, let's go back and have one. And the guy says, okay. He says, yeah. And the guy says, I admit I was being a fool. I'll even buy one. So the guy says he gets back to the bar. All of a sudden he realizes Ray's gone again. And so now he had to walk home again. But that kind of stuff, like I said, it's fun to include some of those characters in your stories. Thoughts or questions?
So what did you do with those, all those 3-ring binders with all those books?
Burned them.
Oh.
Which is interesting, because I had to make a decision about what I was going to do with them, and here's why. That I feel like I'm getting better with every book, and when I went back and looked at those old binders, I just thought that they weren't that good, and I feel like I write so much better now, and my publicist says, you got to get rid of them. If those ever end up online, that people are going to criticize you forever, and so I just made a big bonfire and burned them all up. Yes?
Is there any pattern to your books where you should be one before the other, or are they independent?
They're all standalone mysteries, and they're all solved crimes. But I will say this, that the relationship that starts out in the first book, you get to see develop over the next few books. So there is that piece to it. But they're all standalone mysteries. Good question. Other questions? Yes?
How do you sleep at night?
Well, this happens whether I deal with it or not. I mean, that's the reality of it. And here's an analogy I use sometimes. Let's say, because most often it's men abusing women. And if you had a bunch of men throwing women in the river, and downstream you had women pulling them back out, those women pulling them back out are victim services. They're essential for the survival of some of those women being thrown in the river. But they have no impact on the number being thrown in. If you want to change that number, you have to work with the people who are throwing them in the first place. And so I want someone dealing with those cases who's not going to be bamboozled and fooled by a con artist, who's going to handle it and deal with it appropriately. But are there never any cases that bother me? I actually talk about this at the end of last call. So what do I do when I got a really bad situation and I want to have my brain clear by the time I get home? I find the tackiest song I can find, and I sing it as loud as I can, like 4 times in a row in my car on the way home. And I just hope I don't get in a car accident and people realize that, he listened to Chevy Van 4 times before he died or something like that. But that works. So it's good sometimes to have some tacky songs available. Other questions?
Your
Yes.
next book.
The Haunted House of Hillman.
What?
The Haunted House of Hillman. It's at the editor right now.
Oh,
Yeah. Yes.
Has any of your experience taken you into an area where you run into the role that smart TVs or AI devices have played a role in investigation, providing evidence?
Oh, yeah. Certainly. That,
What
yeah.
are AI devices?
Well,
Explain.
yeah, artificial intelligence.
Oh,
So, well, basically, there is some very good computer stuff, people working with the BCA right now, and they can bring in so much information. And some of the tools are amazing. So for example, if someone gets put on probation and they can require that there's a scanning device on their laptop or cell phone or anything that allows them internet access. If they want to, they can actually put one on that'll pick up any device, even one that's not on in the area. So if the person gets, let's say, a new cell phone like a burner phone and tries to fool the agent, that shows up on that device. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff out there. Yes?
with the sophistication of some of these tests and gadgets and whatever else, is there still the ability to kind of tamper with that evidence?
Oh, certainly, certainly. And that there's always people, you know, for every way of solving things, there's someone making an excuse why it doesn't work. But the truth is, you know, what I do mostly is interview, and I get a lot of confessions in interviews. And part of the way is the way I interview. You know, you see in some of those investigative shows where they're getting in someone's face. That's not how you get information. Because most of the people that you're interviewing, they've had someone in their face their whole life screaming and hollering at them. So the way to get information is to make some sort of connection with them and just have a conversation. And one of the things I don't let them do is talk about the offense right off the bat. If they come in denying it, and they have this story they've rehearsed 25 times, and I say, yeah, I don't really want to hear about it. So I start asking about their childhood, their work, their relationships, their criminal history, why did those relationships end? I get into all these other things. And what's interesting, when you eventually get back to the offense, it makes sense. And that's why profiling works, because the way someone commits a crime tells you about the person who committed that crime. Here's a good example, that if I see a scene that's cleaned up, I know whoever killed that person knew him. Strangers don't clean up crime scenes. And so just from doing enough investigations, right off the bat you start to see things. And keep in mind, any homicide, that homicide was convenient for the person who committed it. That place, that time, all of that. You know, and so think about that. And even the way they commit it, I believe psychopaths are made, not born. Just because I've interviewed enough of them where you see the history. I did an assessment on somebody who stabbed to death a 9-year-old girl. And when I was interviewing the person and going through his history, when he was 9 years old and wet the bed, his mom stabbed him in the groin and he needed to be hospitalized and have surgery. And was raised in a very abusive family. And you see this, it always comes up, there's something from that person's history that's very similar to the crime they committed. Yes?
What mysteries did you read or do you read?
When I was a kid, I read the Hardy Boys, actually. But I read everything. As a matter of fact, I wasn't a great English student. I took as few English classes as I could in high school and college. And when I graduated from college, I thought, I should go back and read all the classics, because I hadn't, because reading was work up to that point. And then I could enjoy it. And I thought, wow, this is really good. And I started reading everything by, Shakespeare and Dickens and all that stuff. And that got me excited about it. And even I write in first person. Some of the chapters are from the investigator's perspective, some are from the victim's perspective, some are from the offender's perspective. Because I have an advantage a lot of writers don't have, is I know how they think, I know how they rationalize. Like I talked about in last call, even killers are heroes in their own stories. And so people say that's creepy when you get to those chapters, but they like them because they said you get an understanding of how that craziness is rationalized. Good question. Yes?
Do you see a lot of cases where you know this person committed the crime, but for whatever reason, some little thing in the law, they get away with it? And
No, but it is the worst part of the job. Sometimes, there's a situation I'm dealing with now where I know who committed this murder, but there isn't enough evidence to convict him.
And what about your own safety then? Do you worry about, is
Well,
there an issue with some of these?
Not really, because for the people I send to prison, when they go to prison, if they ever get out, they know they're probably going to have to deal with me again. And so it's probably in their best interest to have an okay relationship with me. And sometimes in these cold cases, the suspect doesn't even know that I was involved in it. Because what happens, I review all the evidence, I look at all the video interviews, and I'll tell the investigators, I want you to go back and ask these questions to this person.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes?
So with your background, do you ever think of these unsolved, major cases like Zodiac Killer and stuff? In your mind, do you try and figure out who did it?
I have to tell you something. My second book, so when I wrote this book, this is the one book that was actually based on a California case, and I rewrote it as if it happened on I-94 in Minnesota, but it was the I-680 killer in California at the time. And it wasn't solved, and it bugged me because I felt they had the profile wrong. And they thought the person worked in real estate. I thought the person knew a little about law enforcement, but probably had a mundane job for most of his life, was probably single during most of his crimes, had witnessed or experienced abuse as a small child, and probably had a small penis. And when my editor read the book, she says, "What is wrong with you?" And I just said, it's weird, but you work enough cases, and there's ways people commit crimes that, this is the issue. And when there's a lot of overcompensation, like in this case, he was breaking into houses, tying up women, assaulting them, and then making something to eat. He was staying in the home, calling them up a day later, years later, and sending messages to investigators. At one point, there was actually a public meeting, and a guy stood up at the meeting and said, this wouldn't happen if there was a guy in the home with a gun. 2 weeks later, that guy wakes up to a gun to his head, he's tied up, and he assaults his wife in front of her. That kind of, and
They finally caught that guy though, didn't they?
they did. And what's interesting about it, he was caught 4 months after my book came out, and my profile was exactly right. That he had I also had put in there that he had an absent father and a neglectful mother. His dad not only abandoned the family, but he started a new family and named all the kids in his next family the same names as the kids from his first family.
Oh.
It's like, okay, who does that? He had witnessed his sister being raped by 2 adult men at age 7. He had worked in law enforcement for a short period of time, but worked in a grocery store for 26 years. Was single during most of his crimes, because if you're getting by with things for a long time, you're probably single because nobody's saying anything, And he had a small penis. So yeah, you do get, like I said, that it's weird, but you work enough cases, you start to say, okay, this is the issue here when they keep doing things a certain way. I'm gonna go ahead.
My understanding is the lie detector tests aren't admissible in court?
No, they're not admissible in court. Well, you can't use them in a criminal case. You can use them in a civil case. They're used sometimes if someone's suing somebody, but you can't use it to charge somebody with a crime because they're not 100%. Yeah. Yes?
So at the beginning, you indicated that the cover is important and picture on the cover.
Yes.
So the people who are on the cover, they get paid a flat fee or they're working on royalties?
No, they get paid a flat fee. Yeah.
Looking for a model?
And I always am. It's like the next story. Then I got to think, who looks like that now? Who can I find? Yeah. I have to share this with you before I stop. One of my favorite things is when because people use cliches wrong all the time when I'm interviewing them. Then sometimes they're complicated. You have to stop and think. Like, I had someone tell me, you shouldn't throw stones at people who live in glass houses. And I was thinking, what is that saying? Well, the saying is people who live in glass houses shouldn't cast stones. But you probably shouldn't throw stones at people who live in glass houses either. But this is my favorite of all time. Well, I should say to this date, because you always hear something new. But you've all heard the saying, work like you don't need the money, dance like nobody's watching. She says, yeah, my mom always told me, dance like you don't need the money. Like, that's a whole different visual there. Anyway, I want to be respectful of your time, and I will stay here and sell books and answer questions, but thank you so much for coming out tonight.